What if the power behind empires wasn't on the throne, but in the bedroom? For thousands of years, rulers came and went, but in the shadows, courtesans, concubines, and sacred prostitutes quietly pulled the strings of history. They weren't just surviving, they were shaping revolutions, rewriting laws, and even deciding who lived or died. Stay with us to the final chapter, where we reveal how one woman's body changed the fate of an entire civilization. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of long, gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Now lower your lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and settle in. Let's ease into tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 1: The Sacred Origins, Temples of Power and Pleasure. Long before kings ruled with armies and scribes, another kind of power quietly stirred beneath the temple walls. In the ancient cities of Sumer and Babylon, sacred women walked barefoot through incense-scented halls, their eyes painted with kohl and their bodies adorned with jewels. They were not wives. They were not slaves. They were temple priestesses, and their work was more powerful than any sword. These women were believed to bridge the gap between gods and mortals. When they lay with men, it was not lust, it was ritual. Their bodies were vessels of cosmic harmony. Fertility of the land depended on them. Kings sought their blessings before war. Entire regions offered gifts to their temples, believing that divine favor passed through their sacred rites. This wasn't sex for survival, it was sex for salvation. And as men knelt before them, the women of the temples shaped both the heavens and the world below. In the eyes of their people, these women were neither victims nor rebels. They were essential. Their presence made cities feel protected. Their absence foretold doom. When temples closed and priestesses vanished, many believed it was a sign the gods had turned their backs. Even the fall of great civilizations was sometimes attributed to the neglect of sacred unions. Across centuries, a pattern emerged. Where these women thrived, culture flourished. Where they were silenced, decay followed. It was as if they were not just participating in history, but guarding its very heartbeat. As modern historians piece together their stories, the question arises: how much of what we've credited to kings was actually preserved, provoked, or permitted by the quiet presence of women in silk? So here, at the very beginning of civilization, we find the answer already forming. Sex workers, though they were never called that, once held the highest seats in spiritual society. Their work was not scandal. It was ceremony. Their power was not whispered. It was chanted from rooftops. And while their temples may have been swept away by the tides of time, their influence remains embedded in the very foundation of organized society. Before there were kings, there were priestesses. Before there were thrones, there were altars. And behind the earliest triumphs of humanity stood women who carried power not in their swords, but in their touch. It began in Uruk, where the goddess Inanna ruled over love, war, and divine justice. Her priestesses were trained from youth, raised inside temple walls, and taught sacred dances, hymns, and rites of sacred union. The ritual of hieros gamos, divine marriage, saw these women lie with kings during the new year to renew the land's fertility. The act was public, ceremonial, and blessed. People gathered to watch, believing this union between goddess and ruler would ensure prosperity. These women were not shunned. They were celebrated. Some even advised kings, interpreted omens, or managed temple treasuries. As empires rose and fell, the temples endured. When armies came to conquer, they often spared the priestesses, not from mercy, but fear. To violate the divine was to curse your kingdom. Through sacred sensuality, these women claimed a kind of power no warrior could hold, a power older than kingship itself. Farther east, in the Indus Valley and early Vedic India, another form of sacred womanhood emerged, the Devadesis. Bound to the gods from childhood, they served in temples not as nuns, but as performers of divine art. Their dances mimicked cosmic cycles. Their music was meant to enchant the deities. But beyond performance, they too fulfilled sacred duties and rituals involving union, symbolic and sometimes physical, with priests or devotees. These acts were not transactional. They were offerings. To lie with a Devadasi was to touch the divine. For centuries, they enjoyed social respect, legal protections, and material wealth. In kingdoms across India, Devadasis were part of courtly life. Some became cultural patrons. Others acted as secret emissaries. And just like their Sumerian sisters, they blurred the lines between worship and power. In a world dominated by gods, it was these women, not generals or ministers, who whispered into divine ears. As Babylon rose into power, the cult of Ishtar took the sacred feminine to new heights. Ishtar, goddess of love and war, was worshipped with rites that merged pleasure and sacrifice. Her priestesses performed rituals at dawn, lighting fires and smearing themselves with oils to invoke her favor. They taught that desire was a force of creation. Their bodies became the altars on which cosmic balances were restored. During great festivals, they took lovers from among the people, offering themselves not out of indulgence, but out of divine obligation. These acts drew pilgrims, merchants, and rulers from distant lands. The temple of Ishtar in Nineveh became as influential as any palace. Donations poured in. Trade flourished around temple districts. Kings would consult with priestesses before battles. Some were rumored to interpret dreams or deliver prophecies mid-embrace. It was not submission, it was divine control masked in intimacy. From behind veils and silken curtains, they shaped Babylon's legacy. Even in ancient Egypt, echoes of sacred sex work reverberated. While less centralized than in Mesopotamia, the cults of Hathor and Isis incorporated sensual rituals. Hathor, goddess of joy, music, and fertility, was honored by priestesses who often performed rituals meant to awaken divine pleasure. These women hosted festivals where revelry blurred with worship, and intoxication opened the gates to spiritual ecstasy. Sex was never separate from the divine. In some temples, priestesses served in sacred unions meant to align energies between the human and the celestial. Foreigners misunderstood these rituals, seeing them as immoral. But within Egypt, these rites were respected, though shrouded in secrecy. The women performing them often came from elite families. Some held titles, estates, and political ties. They did not just serve gods. They negotiated with nobles, curated temple economies, and safeguarded knowledge passed down through matrilineal lines. Even in death, they were buried with gold, not shame. In these early civilizations, the body was not a curse, it was a conduit. It wasn't until later moral shifts, often spurred by new patriarchal religions, that these women would be rewritten as harlots or forgotten entirely. But their impact was real. They guided kings, inspired poets, and held the ear of the divine. They ran temples, brokered peace, and preserved sacred texts. When cities collapsed and languages died, it was often the rituals and hymns of these women that survived. Clay tablets from Sumer still carry the prayers of sacred priestesses. Ancient Sanskrit texts preserve the songs once sung in temple halls. Their legacy wasn't written by generals. It was sung into eternity by the women who danced beneath moonlight, their footsteps echoing across marble floors. For a time, the world understood that pleasure could be sacred, and power didn't need a crown. But this sanctity would not last forever. As empires grew, as hierarchies tightened, and as male priests gained prominence, the power of sacred women began to shift. In Babylon, temple roles grew more rigid. The once revered priestesses, women of the highest religious order, began to fade from records. In India, devadesses slowly lost their elite status as kings fell and colonial powers rose. Yet even in this decline, they resisted erasure. Some turned to poetry, encoding their wisdom in verses passed through generations. Others adapted, becoming artists, performers, or teachers, still guarding fragments of the old power. And though their temples may have crumbled, their influence moved through time, like smoke clinging to stone. Their stories remained half lost, half remembered, in myths, folk tales, and whispered traditions that modern scholars are only now beginning to understand. It is tempting to think that history has always been ruled from the throne. But dig deep enough and you find altars beneath every palace. You find women whose bodies carried more weight than royal decrees. These priestesses and sacred companions were not courtesans in the later sense. They were oracles, they were bridges, they were architects of meaning. In societies where life was fragile and the will of the gods was law, their ability to channel fertility, pleasure, and prophecy gave them immense sway. And while their power was spiritual, it had very real political consequences. Kings who defied temple orders faced rebellion. Cities that ignored sacred rites saw droughts and famine. These were not coincidences. They were reminders, issued by women who knew the divine could be both merciful and merciless, and that they were its chosen voice. One of the most remarkable aspects of these sacred sex workers was their literacy. In Sumer, some temple women were among the first writers of cuneiform. They composed hymns, recorded rituals, and documented dreams. In India, devadesses were often the only women taught classical Sanskrit and music. These weren't passive roles. They were intellectuals, mystics, and chroniclers. Their words influenced the metaphysics of their cultures. Their songs became scripture. When outsiders invaded, be it Assyrian warlords or British colonizers, they often failed to grasp the depth of this power. What they saw as vice was, in truth, a carefully structured system of balance between spirit, body, and rule. And so, in misunderstanding it, they destroyed it. Yet fragments survived, in broken tablets, faded murals, and whispered chants in back alleys of forgotten cities. Chapter 2: Greece and Rome, Courtesans of Culture and Conquest. In the marble courtyards of Athens, where philosophy blossomed and democracy was born, another kind of influence quietly ruled. It didn't stand behind podiums or wear laurels, but it shaped minds, guided decisions, and outlived empires. The Hetaira of classical Greece were not common prostitutes. They were women of education, refinement, and ambition, trained in rhetoric, poetry, and charm. Unlike Athenian wives, who were confined to domestic life, Hetaira attended symposia, drank wine with statesmen, and debated politics with thinkers. They were more than company, they were companions of the mind. In a world that silenced most women, they spoke freely. Some became muses for playwrights, others wielded enough influence to sway alliances. And though they lacked legal status, their power was undeniable. They weren't on the battlefield, but they shaped the strategy. In whispers and laughter over shared wine, they steered conversations that built cities or destroyed them. Their bodies were currency, but their minds were priceless. What made the Greek and Roman courtesans so influential was not just access, it was adaptability. These women survived constant upheaval. They watched as republics turned to empires, as gods changed names, as laws bent and broke. And through it all, they endured. They became repositories of continuity. When libraries burned and temples collapsed, they carried stories forward, in whispered lullabies, in gestures passed down like scripture. They weren't historians, but they remembered. They weren't generals, but they strategized. They weren't queens, but they ruled. Their existence posed a constant challenge to the male monopoly on history. And perhaps that's why so many of their names were buried. Because to remember them would be to admit that power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, draped in silk, sitting in the shadows, waiting for the world to listen. By the time the Western Roman Empire fell, many of its rulers had been shaped by courtesans, some guided toward wisdom, others toward ruin. But no one could deny their influence. The temples and palaces that once echoed with their laughter fell silent, but their legacy persisted. Even in the ruins of Rome, fragments remain. Stone faces with knowing eyes, poems etched into forgotten walls, and the faint memory of a woman who, with nothing but her mind and her body, changed the fate of a people who refused to name her. One of the most famous Hetaira was Aspasia, the companion of Pericles, Athens' most celebrated statesman. She was an Athenian by birth, which meant she could not be legally married to him, but that didn't matter. She lived as his equal, hosting salons that drew the brightest minds of the city. Philosophers like Socrates were said to admire her intellect. Behind closed doors, Aspasia advised on matters of state. She was blamed for wars, praised for speeches, and loathed by rivals who resented a woman with such influence. But she wasn't alone. Across Greece, Hetaira controlled more than hearts. They curated art, preserved libraries, and trained generations of orators. Their presence made them indispensable to the cultural machinery of Athens. While men debated ideals of justice, these women practiced influence in real time. Their names may have been left off official decrees, but their ideas shaped them. The legacy of Greek civilization carries their fingerprints, etched in stone and verse. As Greek influence spread across the Mediterranean, the role of elite courtesans followed. In cities like Corinth and Ephesus, entire districts were built around these women. They lived in lavish homes, employed servants, and entertained ambassadors. Their patronage could make or break a sculptor. Their conversation could change a merchant's fate. Some amassed fortunes rivaling aristocrats. Others funded temples or theaters. They were not just ornamentation. They were architects of prestige. And while male historians often diminish their importance, the structures they supported remain standing. In a society obsessed with legacy, these women ensured theirs by investing in culture. Behind every great statue or festival, there was often a woman whose influence had been bought not with gold, but with grace, intellect, and the careful art of seduction. They mastered the spaces where men let their guard down, and in doing so, they rewrote the rules of power. Rome inherited Greece's admiration for beauty and learning, but it added its own brutal hunger for dominance. Here, the courtesan evolved again. In the Republic, elite women were expected to be silent. But Rome was also a city of spectacles. As gladiators bled in arenas and emperors poisoned rivals, another war raged in the shadows, fought by women who wore silk instead of steel. These were not wives. They were companions, entertainers, and secret keepers. In Rome, sex was political. Senators frequented brothels not just for pleasure, but for gossip. Courtesans became living repositories of intelligence. They overheard bribes, threats, and strategy. Some sold what they knew to the highest bidder. Others kept the secrets of entire families. Their discretion became a weapon. In the right bed, an ambitious courtesan could make or unmake a senator. And while Rome denied women power in law, it could not stop them from wielding it in private chambers lined with gold. As the empire expanded, the divide between respectable matrons and influential courtesans blurred. Under emperors like Nero and Caligula, the lines of morality were constantly shifting. Some emperors took lovers from the stage. Others married former courtesans outright. In such a volatile court, beauty was only the beginning. Survival required cunning. Women who rose through these ranks mastered the performance of submission while manipulating the currents of ambition. One such woman was Claudia Act, a freedwoman and favorite of Nero. Though once a slave, she became his trusted confidant and advisor. Her background gave her perspective. Her position gave her power. In a palace where loyalty was bought and sold, she became a rare force of restraint, softening Nero's excesses, delaying executions, and influencing imperial decisions without title or crown. Her story, like so many, shows that sex work in Rome was not merely tolerated. It was entwined with the mechanisms of authority. Beyond the palace, the city of Rome pulsed with courtesans of every kind. High-ranking women lived in opulent villas and held court for generals and poets. Lower-ranking workers served in organized brothels under state regulation. But even among these, there were women who rose to notoriety. They used wit, satire, and rumor to raise their station. Some wrote their own epitaphs. Others were buried with honors usually reserved for noble women. The city's obsession with love and scandal meant that a skilled courtesan could become a household name. Their faces were painted on walls, their names carved in graffiti. Some mocked them, others immortalized them in verse, but none could ignore them. They were woven into Rome's mythos, figures of both desire and dread, because they held something more dangerous than favor. They held memory. They remembered what was said behind curtains and who promised what under candlelight. In a city built on secrecy, that was power. Greek and Roman culture revered control. Self-discipline, reason, and order were upheld as virtues. Yet the most powerful men in both civilizations routinely surrendered themselves to women society refused to fully acknowledge. This paradox was not lost on the courtesans. They knew that by offering pleasure, they also gained leverage. In moments of vulnerability, powerful men made careless confessions. In beds lined with perfumed linen, entire plots were born or dismantled. Courtesans were never truly outsiders. They were insiders with masks. They could attend parties, read philosophy, perform on stage, and then retreat into anonymity. It was their ability to shift identities that made them so effective. They became what each client needed: mother, muse, or mirror. And in this shifting, they gathered stories, fears, and ambitions. They became the memory of an empire too proud to write their names into the record, but too indebted to silence them completely. Many historians have tried to separate the cultural achievements of Greece and Rome from the private lives of their people. But the line is an illusion. Art, politics, and sexuality were deeply connected. In Greek plays and Roman satire, courtesans were central figures. They symbolized freedom and danger, wisdom and ruin. They inspired love poems and suicide notes. They advised tyrants and comforted exiles. Their influence was not peripheral. It was structural. While philosophers wrote about ideals, courtesans practiced power. They didn't argue ethics, they manipulated outcomes. In war councils, their names were never mentioned. But in the days before battle, generals often visited them. And in the aftermath of defeat, many sought comfort in their arms. It was there, in the silent hours between ambition and regret, that empires confronted their own fragility, and courtesans quietly picked up the pieces. In the provinces, the power of courtesans adapted to local cultures. In Alexandria, where Greek, Roman, and Egyptian traditions met, women of mixed heritage found unique positions. They spoke multiple languages, understood different rituals, and entertained merchants and governors alike. Some operated salons that became hubs of information. Others provided shelter to political refugees, charging not in coin but in favors. In Gaul and Hispania, Roman officers relied on local women who navigated tribal politics. These women became intermediaries, interpreting both language and desire. They brokered marriages, negotiated trade, and sometimes warned of uprisings. Even far from Rome, the same truth echoed. The right woman in the right bed could be more effective than any soldier. Chapter 3: Forbidden Thrones. Concubines who ruled China. Behind the vermilion gates of the Forbidden City, power whispered through silk screens and shadowed corridors. It did not always wear armor or wield scrolls. Sometimes it painted its lips, adjusted its robes, and knelt with a bowed head. Imperial China, for centuries, was a world where the emperor appeared to rule alone. But behind him stood dozens, sometimes hundreds, of women whose titles were as fluid as their influence. Concubines by name, but far more in truth. They were trained from youth to entertain, to obey, and to charm, but some would learn to command. In a court obsessed with hierarchy and order, it was not the loudest voice that ruled. It was the softest, a glance, a whisper, a night spent beside the emperor. These women learned to read moods like scrolls, to align with factions, and to turn the tides of power without ever raising their voice. The throne may have looked lonely, but it was never truly empty. In modern China, the legacy of these women lingers, though often unspoken. They represent a paradox, figures of both oppression and authority, victims of a system that offered them luxury but denied them freedom. architects of change who could never claim credit. Their stories challenge our ideas of leadership, reminding us that power often thrives in constraint, that the most effective rulers are not always those with titles, but those who understand the human heart. The Forbidden City was a fortress of rules, but its greatest shifts came from those who broke them silently. And so, history bends again, not from the weight of emperors, but from the quiet strength of women who ruled from behind the veil. In the Tang dynasty, a woman named Wu Zhao entered the palace as a low-ranking concubine. She was expected to remain ornamental, a silent part of a larger collection. But Wu was different. She listened, she studied, she memorized every face in the court, every alliance, every whisper. When the emperor died, she should have vanished into a convent. But she returned by seducing his successor. It was a bold move, one that shocked the court, but Wu knew the game better than any of them. One by one, she dismantled her rivals. She played ministers against each other, won the loyalty of the imperial guard, and turned the empress into a puppet. Eventually, she claimed the throne herself, not as an empress consort, but as emperor in her own right. Wu Zetian ruled China for decades. She passed laws, funded education, and crushed rebellions. All this from a woman whose path to power began in a perfumed chamber and a fleeting glance. But not all concubines ruled openly. Most shaped dynasties from behind layers of protocol and tradition. They influenced from within the harem, a sealed world where women competed not just for affection, but survival. A favorite concubine could secure titles for her sons. A neglected one might vanish overnight. These women became masters of intrigue. They sent letters hidden in hairpins, exchanged coded messages through embroidery patterns, and allied themselves with eunuchs who served as their eyes and ears. One wrong move could mean exile or death, but one smart maneuver could secure the next emperor. Some concubines formed alliances with scholars, bribed astrologers, or manipulated superstitions to influence the emperor's dreams. The palace might have appeared tranquil from the outside, but inside, it was a chessboard soaked in perfume and blood. The fate of the empire often rested on who won the emperor's attention and who could keep it. During the Ming dynasty, the imperial harem grew into a city within a city. It had its own hierarchy, rules, and punishments. Girls were taken from across the empire, chosen for their beauty, grace, or family connections. Most never saw the emperor, but a few rose quickly. One such woman, known only as Lady Zheng, captivated the Wanli emperor. Her influence became so great that he defied tradition to make her son his heir, bypassing an older crown prince. This decision sparked a 20-year succession crisis. Ministers protested, factions formed. Civil service exams were disrupted, all because of one woman's place in the emperor's bed. Lady Zheng never held office. She never sat on a throne, yet her desires reshaped the imperial lineage. And her story was not unique. Across generations, women like her redirected dynasties with nothing but proximity and patience. It was in the Qing dynasty, however, that the full extent of concubine power was revealed. In the twilight of empire, as foreign powers pressed at China's borders, a young concubine named Cixi caught the emperor's eye. She bore him a son and, when he died, seized the regency. Officially, she ruled on behalf of the boy. Unofficially, she ruled China. Cixi appointed ministers, ordered executions, and negotiated with Western powers. She built summer palaces and executed coup attempts. Her critics called her manipulative. Her allies called her brilliant. She ruled from behind a silk screen during court meetings, never speaking directly but issuing orders nonetheless. Her command was absolute, and though she was technically never emperor, few men matched her control. Cixi's reign marked the final chapters of imperial China, and it was shaped not by swords or scholars, but by a woman who began her life in the shadows of the inner court. The concubines of China's imperial history were not just passive ornaments. They were scholars, strategists, and survivors. Many were highly educated, fluent in poetry, calligraphy, and politics. Some kept journals that historians would later use to reconstruct palace life. Others influenced fashion, cuisine, and even architecture. Their preferences could become national trends. Their rivalries could spark civil wars. At times, the emperor himself was a prisoner of their competing ambitions. In the outer court, ministers argued over policy. In the inner court, women played games of influence that determined which policies would survive. It was a dual system of governance, one public, one private. And while the former was inscribed in stone, the latter was embroidered into silk. But its impact was no less real. The empire moved to the rhythm of footsteps on polished jade floors. The price of such power, however, was steep. Concubines lived under constant surveillance. Their families were often exiled or used as leverage. Jealous rivals could poison meals or accuse them of witchcraft. If they lost favor, they could be demoted, imprisoned, or quietly killed. Some were forced into silence for years, their influence buried beneath layers of shame. Yet many endured. They developed languages of glances and symbols. They learned when to speak and when to vanish. And when the time was right, they returned with lethal precision. Their survival depended not on brute force, but emotional calculation. They understood the emperor's weaknesses, the court's moods, and the currents of change before anyone else. While soldiers guarded the walls, concubines guarded the future. Their battlefield was the emperor's heart, and they fought with a patience that outlasted generals. What makes the story of imperial concubines so striking is how systematically it has been erased. Official histories often downplayed their roles, attributing decisions to emperors alone. But court records, memoirs, and private letters tell another story. They speak of women who whispered policy into sleeping ears, who chose successors with a nod, who bribed scholars to rewrite law, who raised princes to believe certain truths and forget others. Even in art, these women were depicted as flowers or shadows, decorative and mysterious. But behind every image was a mind calculating the next move. They understood that visibility was danger. Influence required camouflage, and so they ruled without ruling. They commanded without being named. And in doing so, they preserved their own kind of sovereignty. The Forbidden City still stands in Beijing. Its halls are silent now, its courtyards empty. But if the walls could speak, they would not tell tales of emperors alone. They would remember the rustle of silk in the moonlight, the hurried footsteps of messengers carrying secrets, the sound of a woman's voice, low and firm, behind a painted screen. These stories do not appear on monuments. They are not taught in school books, yet they explain the strange pivots of history, the sudden policy shifts, the unexplained executions, the unexpected heirs. They are the echoes of women who ruled without crowns, who knew that the greatest power is the kind no one sees coming. Chapter 4: The Empire of Desire, India's Courtesan Kingdoms. In the golden age of ancient and medieval India, not all political salons were found in palaces. Some stood tucked behind perfumed curtains, where velvet cushions and carved sandalwood screens lined the walls. There, courtesans presided like queens. They were not born into royalty, but they shaped it. These were not the temple-bound devadeses of old, but the Tawaifs, Ganikas, and Nagarvadu, urban courtesans who fused art, intelligence, and seduction into a force more persuasive than any army. They were musicians, poets, and dancers, but they were also advisors, diplomats, and cultural gatekeepers. In a land of shifting kingdoms and spiritual complexity, they stood at the center of power and desire. And they were not bought, they were sought. Kings traveled miles for their conversation. Poets immortalized them, and sultans rewrote laws for them. Their salons were not dens of pleasure. They were courts of influence, where ideas were tested, alliances whispered, and empires quietly bent to their will. Today, the descendants of courtesans still fight for recognition. Some are artists struggling against stigma. Others are activists preserving the traditions their grandmothers kept alive in secret. Museums have begun to exhibit their stories. Songs once sung only in private are now performed on global stages. Slowly, the veil of shame is lifting. The empire of desire they once ruled is no longer hidden. It is remembered. And as modern India reclaims its past, these women step forward again. Not in flesh, but in memory, in music, in ink, in fire. They remind us that influence does not always come from the top. Sometimes it rises from the margins, burning brighter because it was never supposed to exist. Courtesans of India were never passive. They were not ornaments or mere distractions. They were power, not in the form history usually recognizes, but in ways more enduring. They reshaped hearts and minds, not through conquest, but through culture. They healed the wounds of war with music. They carried forbidden knowledge in their songs. They rewrote politics in metaphors, and they showed, time and again, that true power doesn't always need a crown. Sometimes it only needs a voice, and a room full of people willing to listen. The city of Vaishali, one of the world's earliest republics, once declared a courtesan as its official consort. Amrapali, famed for her beauty and intellect, was not just entertainment. She was an institution. Chosen by the people, not the palace, she represented the democratic spirit of a society that recognized the unique power of a woman who could enthrall both the commoner and the king. Amrapali's influence stretched across borders. Her residence became a hub of diplomacy. Warring factions sought her favor, and when she chose to leave that life, her renunciation was so dramatic it shook the city's foundations. Yet even in retirement, her legend grew. Buddhist texts honored her transformation, but political histories reveal her earlier reign, not of thrones, but of minds. She stands as proof that India's courtesans did not wait to be noticed. They shaped their own spotlight, and their glow illuminated corridors of power long before history dared write them in. In the royal courts of medieval India, particularly under Mughal rule, the Tawaif culture flourished. These courtesans were more than entertainers. They were educators in etiquette, stewards of Urdu poetry, and keepers of musical tradition. Young nobles were often sent to Tawaif salons to learn refinement before entering public life. It was there that they mastered language, learned how to compose verses, how to negotiate with grace, how to read silence. In these schools of pleasure and intellect, future ministers and generals were molded. But the courtesans were not merely instructors. Many were kingmakers. Some controlled property, commanded armed guards, and maintained trade networks. Their influence flowed through every layer of court life, and they understood timing, when to whisper advice, when to withdraw, and when to demand. In cities like Lucknow and Delhi, the name of a respected Tawaif could open doors faster than any letter of introduction. And behind their charm was calculation honed sharper than any blade. Among the most legendary of these women was Malaka Bai of Hyderabad. She was not just a courtesan. She was a published poet, a trained archer, and a political counselor to the Nizam of Hyderabad. In a court filled with nobles, it was Malaka who received diplomatic guests and composed verses to calm rising tempers. Her salon became a crossroads for artists, rebels, and visionaries. She amassed wealth, built temples, and donated land. Her writings survive today, rare echoes of a woman's voice in a world that tried to silence them. But Malaka's story was not unique. Across India, dozens of courtesans left marks on architecture, literature, and even legal policy. They paid taxes, sponsored public works, and debated theology with saints and scholars alike. They were impossible to categorize. Not wives, not queens, not servants, but something else entirely, living contradictions, whose elegance masked the steel of survival and the brilliance of strategy. In Rajputana, some courtesans held enough influence to stop wars. During one infamous conflict between rival kings, a single courtesan, never named in official records, was dispatched to the enemy camp. Her mission was not assassination. It was persuasion. She arrived with gifts, danced before the court, and spoke to the prince in riddles and rhymes. Within days, the war was called off. A peace accord was signed.
No drone, no era ulus.
Just a story spun over wine and poetry, whispered through a veil. Historians dismissed it as coincidence. But those who knew court politics understood. The unseen hand had moved, and it wore bangles, not armor. Such episodes were not rare. In an age where open diplomacy was seen as weakness, courtesans provided a silent channel for negotiation. They softened rivalries, carried secret messages, and turned vendettas into romances. They were not spies. They were storms, wrapped in silk and measured in silence. Beyond politics, these women preserved and elevated the arts. In an era where invasions and religious reforms often threatened cultural traditions, it was the courtesans who kept them alive. They maintained gharanas of music, preserved classical dance forms like Kathak and Odissi, and curated oral histories passed down through generations. In doing so, they became custodians of identity. Temples were razed, manuscripts burned. But the Tawaif sang the old songs, danced the forbidden rhythms, and whispered stories into the ears of children who would carry them forward. They knew their power was transient. Kingdoms fell, fortunes vanished, but art endured. And as long as they kept the music alive, they kept themselves alive, etched not in stone but in melody. In this, they were more than survivors. They were architects of a cultural resilience that defied conquerors and colonizers alike. The British colonial era cast a long shadow over this world. Victorian morality, imported with missionary zeal, rebranded India's courtesans as degenerates. Their salons were shut down, their art labeled obscene, their influence dismantled piece by piece. Yet even then they resisted. Some took their talents to the stage, becoming the first Indian actresses. Others joined independence movements, using their wealth to fund rebels. A few, stripped of protection and status, vanished into poverty. But their memory lingered. Folk songs remembered them. Families told their stories in hushed tones. And as India approached its modern age, artists and filmmakers began to rediscover these women, not as temptresses, but as heroines of survival, voices of defiance, and founders of forgotten kingdoms. Their reputations had been tarnished by colonizers, but their legacies remained intact, waiting, smoldering beneath the ashes of a puritanical rewrite. In literature, the courtesan became a figure of myth, half tragic, half divine. Writers like Mirza Ghalib and Ismet Chuftai crafted tales that painted them as complex, layered characters. Not victims, not villains, but people who navigated impossible choices with elegance. Their lives were hard, but never empty. Their sacrifices often went unacknowledged, but their footprints appeared everywhere, in the phrasing of love poems, the techniques of classical singers, the architecture of certain neighborhoods. Even their language shaped India's vernacular. Urdu, with all its sensual precision and emotional depth, flourished in their salons. They were not only its patrons, they were its mothers, and in every whispered ghazal or tragic thumri, their breath still lingers. Even when their names were lost, their influence stayed rooted in the soil like a secret bloom. In Bollywood's golden age, the figure of the courtesan returned to the screen. Films like Pakiza and Umrao Jan immortalized their grace, even as they sanitized their realities. Still, these stories stirred something ancient. A collective memory resurfaced. A recognition that these women had once stood shoulder to shoulder with kings, poets, and revolutionaries. The public, long taught to view them with disdain, began to reconsider. Researchers uncovered memoirs, historians unearthed letters, and what they found was not filth or shame, but brilliance. These courtesans were thinkers, builders, patrons. They influenced India's transition from feudal courts to modern politics. They were bridges between eras, between cultures, between classes. And they had done it all without permission, without titles, without apology. Chapter 5: Veiled Power, the Harem and the Ottoman Empire. To the outsider, the Ottoman harem appeared to be a golden cage, a place of luxury and confinement, silk robes and silent obedience. But within its walls, power moved beneath the surface like a quiet river. The Topkapi Palace was not just the seat of the Sultan's rule. It was also home to hundreds of women, each selected, trained, and ranked according to their grace, intelligence, and ability to please. At first glance, they were possessions, but over time they became strategists. The harem was no idle paradise. It was a university of ambition. The women learned languages, history, poetry, and court politics. They watched, they waited, and some of them ruled. The Sultan may have signed the edicts, but many bore the fingerprints of women who never stepped beyond the iron gates. Their influence was wrapped in silence, but their reach extended to the very center of imperial power. The harem no longer exists, Its corridors now echo with footsteps of tourists instead of eunuchs. Its silk curtains gather dust, but its legacy endures in the resilience of women navigating oppressive systems. In the hidden ways influence still works, soft, indirect, potent. These were women who mastered the art of invisibility, who turned restriction into strategy. They remind us that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums beneath the surface, shaping worlds with a glance, a gesture, a breath. And as we look back, we realize that the question isn't whether these women ruled. It's why we were ever taught to believe they didn't. At the core of this hidden empire stood the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan. She had once been a concubine herself, rising through the ranks with skill and subtlety. Now, she commanded the harem and oversaw its complex network of loyalties and rivalries. But her power didn't end at the harem's door. She consulted with viziers, appointed officials, and even influenced decisions on war and diplomacy. In the 16th century, Hafsa Sultan, mother of Suleiman the Magnificent, transformed the Valide's position into an institution of political consequence. She built mosques, patronized scholars, and mediated palace conflicts. And she did it all without a crown. Her authority flowed not from a title, but from proximity, from knowing the emperor as no one else did, and from controlling the one resource no minister could match: access to the royal ear in the intimacy of morning light or quiet grief. As the empire grew more complex, so did the ambitions within the harem. Rival factions developed, and women began to use alliances, rumors, and favors as weapons. This was not petty jealousy, it was political maneuvering. When one woman's son became heir, others plotted to install theirs instead. Assassinations occurred under the guise of illness. Exiles were arranged with staged scandals. These were not stories of women tearing each other down for vanity. They were wars fought in whispers, shaped by survival and the desire to protect bloodlines. The stakes were imperial succession, and often the outcome determined the future of the entire Ottoman realm. It was a dangerous game, but some women played it better than the generals outside the palace gates. They saw every conversation as a move, every shift in favor as a chance, and when opportunity struck, they did not hesitate. The most formidable of these players was Courtesan Sultan. Brought to the palace as a slave, she rose to become the favorite of Sultan Ahmed I. But her real ascent began after his death. Her son, Murad IV, was too young to rule, so Courtesan acted as regent. Behind veils and screens, she directed the empire. She ordered executions, balanced the treasury, and suppressed rebellions. Later, when her grandson took the throne, she returned to power again. She ruled through 3 generations of sultans, often holding more authority than the men she served. But her reign was not unchallenged. Enemies grew, plots thickened, and eventually she was strangled by rivals in her own palace. Yet even her death revealed her impact. The empire mourned, ministers feared, and history could not forget her. Courtesan had turned the harem into a throne room, and her life proved that power, when wielded in silence, could reshape the world without ever being seen. Not all harem women ruled through sons. Some, like Harem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana, built empires of influence through sheer intelligence and charm. Once a concubine from what is now Ukraine, she captured the heart of Suleiman the Magnificent. He broke centuries of tradition to marry her, an act that shocked the empire. But Harem was not content with love. She used her position to forge alliances, engage in statecraft, and establish a lasting legacy. She built schools, baths, and charitable foundations. Her correspondence with foreign rulers reads like that of a seasoned diplomat. Through her, the concept of the Ottoman queen consort evolved. She was not hidden. She was vocal, visible, and effective. Her influence shifted policies and altered the balance of power between court and clergy. And long after her death, her story inspired both fear and fascination, proof that her name had outlived the empire's shifting dynasties. But the harem was not merely a stage for a few standout women. It was a system designed to absorb and elevate talent. Girls were brought in from across the empire: Greek, Circassian, Albanian, Arab, trained in etiquette, conversation, and court philosophy. They memorized royal lineages, studied Islamic jurisprudence, and rehearsed every gesture that might please the sultan. For many, it was their only path out of poverty or obscurity. A select few rose to power. Others became stewards of the harem's bureaucracy, managing budgets, resolving disputes, and mentoring the next generation. The Topkapi Palace was not just home to wives and lovers. It was an incubator of stateswomen. These women never marched into battle, but their decisions sent armies to the field. They never addressed the public, but their words shaped decrees. They never sat on a throne, but they directed the man who did. The outside world imagined the harem as a space of indulgence, but within the empire, it was treated with reverence and fear. Ministers knew their proposals could live or die depending on harem influence. Foreign ambassadors tried to curry favor with harem insiders to sway the sultan's mind. Some even sent gifts specifically designed for the Valide sultan or the chief consort, knowing their approval mattered more than a dozen official endorsements. The Venetian ambassador once remarked that the true ruler of the Ottoman Empire wore no turban. He wasn't wrong. The lines between intimacy and authority had blurred, and those who underestimated the women behind the curtain often paid with their careers or their heads. By the 18th century, the power of the harem began to wane as the empire modernized. Yet even in decline, it remained a symbol of influence. The women who had ruled it passed their knowledge through whispers and stories. Their architecture remained: ornate fountains, secret chambers, inscriptions in forgotten languages. And their legacy lived on in the decisions they had shaped. The education reforms, the peace treaties, the tax codes that survived centuries often bore their invisible mark. They were ghosts in the machinery of empire, present even in their absence. While the empire publicly glorified male conquest, its continuity often depended on female calculation. The veil was not a barrier to power. It was its cloak, and the harem, far from being a prison, was a parliament built in secret. Even today, the legacy of these women sparks debate. Some see them as victims of patriarchy, symbols of exploitation. Others view them as survivors and manipulators of a closed system, using every available tool to rise in a world designed to silence them. The truth lies somewhere in between. They were both. They were human. They suffered and triumphed. They were denied names in some histories, yet their fingerprints remain on every page. Their ability to shape the state through seduction, wisdom, and restraint proves that the path to influence does not always follow straight lines. Curves, flows, and sometimes disappears before re-emerging stronger. In the Ottoman harem, sex work was not merely a role. It was a position of potential power, carved out through centuries of struggle and immortalized in the quiet revolutions it birthed. Chapter 6: The Secret Weapon. Spies, Scandals, and Revolution. In the age of revolutions and empires, when generals drew maps with blood and politicians wrote laws in ink, there was another battlefield, one hidden behind lace curtains and whispered promises. In salons, drawing rooms, and lavish boudoirs, sex workers became the invisible hands shaping the destinies of nations. They were neither soldiers nor diplomats, yet they held the secrets of both. Their weapons were seduction and silence. Their missions were cloaked in rumor. From the court of Versailles to the trenches of World War I, the courtesan emerged as the perfect spy, trusted by men in power, underestimated by enemies, and always listening. As kings fell and borders shifted, their presence remained constant. They were there before the revolt, during the coup, and long after the treaties were signed. And while history often erased their names, their fingerprints remained on the pages that defined entire eras. In modern intelligence communities, the legacy of these women lives on. The CIA, MI6, and Mossad have all employed operatives trained in seduction and psychological manipulation. Today, they are called agents, operatives, analysts, but their methods still echo the tactics of courtesans past. Listening, observing, blending in, disarming targets with charm. What was once dismissed as scandal is now studied as science. Behavioral analysis, interpersonal leverage, deep cover. And though the language has changed, the essence remains. Emotional access is power, and sex, when used with intent, remains one of the most potent tools in the history of espionage. These truths are rarely admitted publicly, but behind closed doors, the intelligence world still remembers who taught them best. The story of sex workers as spies is not just about secrets and seduction. It is about transformation, about taking a role meant to demean and turning it into agency. These women were not just listeners. They were interpreters. They read between lines, saw through lies, and used those insights to shape events larger than themselves. From royal bedrooms to battlefield bunkers, they moved history forward in ways no one expected. Their legacy is not carved on monuments, but it runs like an underground river through every chapter of modern politics. And in their shadows, we see the outline of a different kind of hero, one who fought not with fists, but with focus, one who turned whispers into weapons, and one who reminds us that sometimes the most powerful revolutionaries are the ones who never get caught. In 18th century France, the line between court entertainment and political espionage grew dangerously thin. The salons of Paris were filled with powerful men, eager for affection and loose with information. Women like Jeanne de Valois, involved in the infamous affair of the diamond necklace, used their connections to sway public opinion, manipulate royal perception, and stir unrest against Queen Marie Antoinette. That scandal would fuel the fires of revolution. But it was not just about a stolen necklace. It was about how rumors, fed by women in the shadows, could bring down a monarchy. Courtesans listened as nobles boasted of secret plans, military strategies, and scandals worth gold. They remembered, they relayed, and sometimes they invented. In a world built on appearances, they mastered deception, and their knowledge became currency. When governments wanted information, they often turned to the very women they publicly shamed. Because no one knew a man's truth better than the one he tried to impress in the dark. During the Napoleonic Wars, intelligence gathering became essential to survival. Courtesans were frequently employed as informants by both the French and their enemies. With access to military officers, diplomats, and foreign spies, they moved between beds and battlefields. One woman, known only as Rose, operated from a luxury brothel near the Tuileries Palace. She was said to entertain generals by night and relay troop movements by morning. Her intel prevented several ambushes. Another unnamed agent worked for the British, seducing a French colonel and stealing correspondence that would later be used in a key treaty negotiation. These women were not amateurs. They trained in conversation, in psychology, in concealment. They coded messages into embroidery, passed notes through perfume bottles, and used theatrical performances as covers for clandestine meetings. Their lives were a constant performance, their survival dependent on knowing what to say, and when to say nothing at all. By the late 19th century, with Europe entangled in espionage and empire, sex workers found themselves at the center of the intelligence web. But none became as infamous as Mata Hari. Born Margaretha Zell in the Netherlands, she reinvented herself as an exotic dancer and courtesan, captivating audiences and military officers alike. Her mystique gave her access to the upper echelons of European society during World War I. She was courted by the French and accused of working for the Germans. Arrested in 1917 and executed for espionage, her trial became a spectacle. Was she truly a double agent, or a scapegoat for a failing intelligence network? The truth remains murky, but her story revealed the dangerous double standard of power and blame. Men used her, governments blamed her, but it was her image, sensual, mysterious, deadly, that survived. She became a symbol of female power feared by empires and ultimately destroyed by them. Beyond the famous, there were countless unnamed women who shaped revolutions from the margins. In Russia, during the final days of the Tsars, courtesans moved freely among aristocrats and Bolsheviks alike. Some smuggled documents, others financed rebellions. One, a brothel owner in St. Petersburg, allegedly provided safe houses for Lenin's operatives. In Hungary, during the 1848 revolution, a courtesan named Ilona used her access to Austrian officers to leak their plans to Hungarian fighters. She was eventually arrested, but never betrayed her contacts. These women operated on the razor's edge of loyalty and danger. Their roles were fluid. Today a lover, tomorrow a traitor, the next day a martyr. They understood that politics was not confined to parliaments and battlefields. It also lived in whispered confessions, in drunken boasts, in letters tucked under pillows. They turned their marginalization into opportunity, because while others underestimated them, they listened and remembered everything. In colonial settings, especially in North Africa and Asia, European powers weaponized sex as a means of control. But the women involved flipped the script. In Algeria, during the French occupation, courtesans embedded within military outposts gathered information for resistance groups. In British India, several Tawaifs continued their legacy, not just as artists, but as informants against colonial rule. Their salons became sites of resistance disguised as performance. Songs were coded with revolutionary messages. Poetry critiqued the oppressors while appearing to praise them. It was rebellion through rhythm, protest through pleasure, and while their names often went unrecorded, their influence lingered in the stories passed down. Some were caught and disappeared without trial. Others faded into obscurity, their legacies wrapped in mystery. But their impact was undeniable. Empires relied on control. These women mastered subversion, and their work proved that seduction could be far more effective than swords. Even in the early 20th century, as war once again engulfed Europe, the use of courtesans as spies intensified. During World War II, the Nazis and Allies both employed women in espionage roles. Some were trained agents. Others stumbled into their positions through relationships with powerful men. A French woman known as Violette ran a nightclub in Lyon that doubled as a listening post for the resistance. She charmed German officers, extracted critical intel, and relayed it through her musicians. She was never arrested. She knew how to disappear behind a smile. In Italy, a courtesan named Luciana infiltrated fascist gatherings and recorded their conversations using hidden wires sewn into her dresses. These women used their assumed powerlessness as cover. No one suspected them, and that made them lethal. They didn't need guns. They had access, and in war, access was everything. But not all spy work involved espionage for political causes. In some cases, sex workers gathered intelligence simply to survive. In occupied territories, many women were forced into relationships with soldiers. But within that nightmare, some became vital sources of information for underground movements. They memorized maps, noted troop schedules, hid radios in bedsheets. Every night was a gamble. Every client a potential executioner. But they kept going, because they believed in a world where their children might not have to use their bodies to be heard. Their bravery was rarely honored. Their names were buried. Yet without them, many resistance efforts would have failed. They were the forgotten agents, the ones without medals or parades. But their legacy was survival, the ultimate act of rebellion against forces that tried to erase them. After the wars ended, many of these women vanished into silence. Some retired in shame, their service denied by governments that had once used them. Others died young, forgotten by history. A few lived long enough to tell their stories, but only when society was finally ready to listen. Films, novels, and memoirs began to explore the complex morality of their roles. Were they heroes, victims, manipulators? The truth was more complicated. They were all of those things, and more. They were women caught between desire and duty, using what little power they had to change the course of empires. Their stories force us to reconsider what makes a hero. Is it a soldier with a rifle, or a woman with a secret? And what does it mean to win a war no one ever admits you fought? Chapter 7, Erased Yet Eternal. The Modern Echoes of Invisible Queens. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world had forgotten the names of priestesses, courtesans, and concubines who once whispered power into the ears of kings. The sacred robes were gone, the royal chambers locked, and the veils drawn over memory. In their place came shame. Sex work, once revered or at least respected in empires past, was recast as vice. Morality movements swept across Europe and America, criminalizing women who had once influenced empires. The courtesan became the criminal, the salon became the brothel, and history turned its face. But the power did not vanish, changed shape. These women became invisible queens, still present, still vital, but no longer allowed to rule in the open. They adapted, some became activists, others lived in silence. A few sparked revolutions. Their names may be buried under layers of scandal and silence, but their stories still echo in the movements, media, and politics that followed. The legacy of these women is not about morality. It is about memory. They remind us that history is not only written by victors. It is shaped by those who endure, those who love, those who are denied thrones yet rule anyway. From priestess to spy, from courtesan to queen, their line is unbroken. Their power is not gone. It is just dressed differently. In every era, in every revolution, they leave fingerprints that no historian can fully scrub away. They shaped kings, saved cities, spoke secrets that redirected wars. And though they were often punished for wielding such influence, they never stopped. The crown may not sit on their heads, but the weight of history rests in their hands. And so we end with a story. In 1955, in Tunisia, a courtesan named Habiba Messika was murdered in her home. She had been a singer, an actress, and a lover of political radicals. Her death sparked riots. Thousands marched in her name. Her songs were banned, then resurrected. Her grave became a pilgrimage site. She had no title, no army, but she had something else. She had a voice, and in her voice, a nation found itself. A courtesan remembered not for scandal, but for revolution. In the end, that is the lesson. Power does not always wear a crown. Sometimes it walks barefoot. Sometimes it sings. And sometimes it is the woman history tried hardest to forget. In 1905, in the streets of Calcutta, a procession gathered around the funeral of a courtesan named Gauhar Jan. She had once been a star, the first Indian artist to record music on gramophone. Her songs carried across the colonial world. But her fame came not just from her voice. She had hosted gatherings of poets and thinkers, challenging colonial narratives with every note and gesture. Her death drew thousands, yet official newspapers barely mentioned her. She had no titles, no land, just music, memory, and influence that would outlast empires. Women like Gauhar Jan were cultural dynamos, blending seduction and scholarship in a society eager to erase their contributions. Their salons preserved endangered languages, revived fading art forms, and created spaces for resistance. But their work, housed in memory instead of stone, was easy to overlook. Even as history denied them a page, the public kept their songs alive. Not all monuments are made of marble. Some echo in melody. In America, the early 20th century brought a different kind of erasure. The moral panic of the progressive era targeted brothels with reformist zeal. The women who had once influenced businessmen and politicians in parlor houses were now labeled threats to civilization. Yet many of these women had already been shaping labor rights, health movements, and suffrage networks. One madam in San Francisco ran an underground clinic that treated hundreds of immigrant women a week, offering services no hospital would touch. Another, in New York, secretly funded civil rights campaigns while dodging police raids. They wore no sashes or suffragette whites, but they carved space in a system designed to exclude them. Their clients were men of power. Their leverage was silence or exposure, and they wielded it with care. Publicly shunned, privately courted, they moved policy from behind heavy curtains. They fought not for fame, but for survival. and in surviving, they pushed history forward. As Hollywood rose, another transformation took place. The courtesan's image was repackaged, sanitized, and sold on screen. Glamorous, tragic, mysterious. Film gave us stories of the fallen woman with a heart of gold. But while cinema profited from these tales, real women were punished for living them. Actresses like Theda Bara and later Marilyn Monroe evoked the aura of seduction, channeling centuries of courtesan mythos. Yet both struggled under the weight of that legacy. Off-screen, women who navigated power through sexuality were scorned. On screen, they were adored. The contradiction fueled a culture of voyeurism and denial. And while stars flickered in the spotlight, sex workers continued to build influence from the shadows. They leaked political scandals, financed art movements, and sparked tabloid sensations that shifted elections. The line between myth and memory blurred. Behind every headline was a name not mentioned. But her touch, her voice, her presence shaped what came next. In the 1960s and 70s, the sexual revolution brought new language, but not always new freedom. Feminist movements clashed over whether sex work was empowerment or exploitation. Yet amid the debates, some women took center stage. In France, Griselda Disraeli declared herself a writer, activist, and sex worker openly. She wrote about her clients, her politics, her pain. Her words unsettled readers, not because they were crude, but because they were true. In America, Margot St. James founded Coyote, one of the first sex worker advocacy groups. She lobbied lawmakers, marched with feminists, and demanded rights in a world still too eager to forget. These women reclaimed the courtesan's voice, not as decoration, but as declaration. They reminded the world that power does not require permission. And though they lacked crowns or thrones, they governed movements. Their work laid the foundation for modern discussions of consent, agency, and dignity. They were not the first to fight, just the first to fight out loud. In South Korea during the 1980s, a quiet resistance began. The nation's rapid industrialization had displaced thousands of women into red-light districts, many of them former comfort women from Japan's occupation. Forgotten by treaties and ignored by governments, these women began to speak. One, known only as Halmiani, gave testimony about the atrocities she faced, not just from wartime abuse but from decades of post-war neglect. Her words sparked outrage, protests erupted, and slowly policies changed. By the early 2000s, memorials were erected, not for generals, for grandmothers. Women who had once been treated as shameful footnotes became national symbols of endurance. Their struggle wasn't about reclaiming pride. It was about demanding justice. And in doing so, they shifted how nations viewed history. Their bodies had been battlefields, but their stories became monuments. Not all queens wear silk. Some wear scars. Even in the digital age, the legacy of historical sex workers endures. Online platforms gave modern workers new tools. Some became influencers, educators, and authors. Others launched campaigns to decriminalize their profession and protect their rights. From Brazil to the Philippines, movements formed around labor, dignity, and safety. These were not anonymous protesters. They were women with pasts, with professions, with purpose. And though many governments continued to criminalize them, their voices only grew louder. They marched in parades, filed lawsuits, hosted podcasts, taught classes. They rewrote the narrative. No longer passive recipients of history, they became its authors. Like the temple priestesses of Sumer or the salon queens of Renaissance Europe, they knew how to command attention. But now they demanded acknowledgement, not just in art or scandal, but in law and culture. They were no longer waiting for a king's ear. They were addressing the world directly. Pop culture finally began to catch up. Television shows, novels, and films shifted away from tired tropes. Characters like Inara from Firefly or Maeve from Westworld reimagined sex workers as complex, powerful, and fully human. Historical fiction explored the lives of real women: Kozum Sultan, Amrapali, Theodora, not as side notes, but as central figures. Museums curated exhibits on the hidden histories of courtesans. Universities taught courses on sexuality and empire. Bit by bit, the walls of silence crumbled. But this resurgence wasn't just entertainment. It was revelation, a reckoning with the erasures of the past. And as stories surfaced, so did questions. Why were these women erased? Who decided their legacies didn't matter? And what might we still learn if we let them speak? Their lives, once taboo, became keys to understanding power itself. Not through conquest, but through connection. Still, the fight is not over. Sex workers continue to face violence, poverty, and stigma across the globe. Many are still denied health care, housing, and safety. Some disappear without a trace. Others are arrested simply for surviving. But in every country, in every century, they have found ways to persist. They form unions, build shelters, write memoirs. And when the world turns its back, they turn to each other. In those spaces of solidarity, they rebuild the power they once held. Not as fantasies or scandals, but as people, as thinkers, as leaders. Their resistance is quiet, but relentless. And their existence, generation after generation, proves one thing: no matter how many times history tries to erase them, they return. They adapt and they endure.